The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the cemetery. The air was cool, the evening quiet, save for the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. Maria had been walking through the cemetery for nearly an hour, her footsteps soft and steady against the gravel path. She often came here, finding solace in the peaceful surroundings, away from the bustle of everyday life. This cemetery was small, nestled on the edge of town, but it had always been a place of reflection for her, a place where she could clear her mind. Today, however, something felt different. As she passed row after row of graves, a subtle tension seemed to hang in the air. It was as though the wind itself was holding its breath. Maria brushed it off as her own unease, perhaps a result of the difficult week she'd had. But then, as she neared the far corner of the cemetery, she saw her. A young girl was sitting by one of the graves. She was alone, her back hunched, her shoulders trembling as she sobbed quietly. Maria paused for a moment, unsure whether to approach. The girl's cries seemed almost out of place here, in the serene quiet of the graveyard. Maria could see that the girl's hands were pressed tightly to her face, her head bent low, as if she were lost in a grief too heavy for her small frame to bear. Maria took a slow step forward, instinctively drawn to the girl, wondering if she was okay. She hesitated, unsure if she should disturb her, but the tears in the girl's silent sobs tugged at her heart. "Hey, are you all right?" Maria called softly, her voice gentle but loud enough to be heard over the wind. The girl didn't look up. She didn't move at all, her sobs continuing, quiet but full of despair. Maria, still standing a few feet away, felt a twinge of concern. She stepped closer, her voice quieter now. "Are you lost, sweetie? Do you need help?" Finally, the girl lifted her head. Her eyes were wide, filled with tears, and her face was pale. She didn't say anything at first, but her gaze shifted toward the grave she was sitting beside. Maria followed her eyes, her curiosity growing. The gravestone was old, weathered by time, the letters faded and hard to read. Maria glanced back at the girl. "Who's this?" she asked softly. The girl blinked, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, still not speaking. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind moving through the trees. The girl's lips trembled, as though she were struggling to speak, her gaze fixed firmly on the grave. Then very softly, almost as if she were speaking to herself, the girl whispered, "My mother, but she's not here anymore. Not really." Maria's heart sank. She didn't know what to say. She crouched down to the girl's level, trying to offer some comfort. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice full of empathy. "It must be hard. Is there anything I can do for you?" The girl didn't respond. Instead, her eyes widened, and for a brief moment, Maria thought she saw a flicker of something strange in the girl's expression. A flicker of fear, of something far deeper than grief. And then, as if answering the unspoken question that hung in the air, the girl's voice broke the silence, low and strained. "She's here." Maria looked around the graveyard, her eyes scanning the rows of tombstones. The wind had picked up again, the air growing heavier, colder. She hadn't seen anyone else, not in this area, but the girl's words sent a shiver down her spine. "Who?" Maria asked, her voice barely a whisper. The girl turned her gaze back to the gravestone, her expression becoming one of confusion, and perhaps fear. "She's not gone," the girl said, her voice trembling. "Not completely. Not yet." Maria's breath caught in her throat. She opened her mouth to ask more, but before she could speak, the ground beneath them seemed to shift, the earth vibrating slightly, almost imperceptibly. Maria felt it in her bones, a low hum that seemed to rise from deep within the ground. The girl's eyes widened with terror. The ground beneath their feet seemed to hum, a low, unsettling vibration that Maria could feel deep in her chest. It wasn't like anything she had ever experienced before. It felt as though the very earth was alive, as if something deep within the cemetery had been disturbed. Maria looked at the girl, whose face had gone pale, her wide eyes filled with an unmistakable fear. "Do you feel that?" Maria asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her gaze still locked on the girl. The girl nodded slowly, her mouth opening slightly as if she was about to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She glanced nervously over her shoulder, her body tense, as if she expected something, someone, to emerge from the shadows. Maria's heart raced. She stood up, glancing around the graveyard, her breath catching in her throat as the wind picked up once more, swirling around her almost angrily. She felt as though the very air had shifted, the once calm and peaceful space now heavy with a strange, oppressive energy. The girl shifted uncomfortably beside the grave, her hands gripping the edges of her dress tightly. Then with a shaking hand, she pointed toward the grave with a trembling finger, her voice hoarse as she spoke. "She's coming. She doesn't want anyone to know." Maria followed the girl's gaze, her eyes narrowing at the old gravestone. The letters were too worn to make out, but the air surrounding the grave felt thick, suffocating. The ground around it seemed to ripple, as if the earth was alive, moving, waiting. "What do you mean?" Maria asked, stepping closer, her instincts now telling her that something was terribly wrong. The girl's words were not just born from grief. There was something else, something darker. The girl's gaze locked onto Maria's. Her eyes were wide, desperate. "She never left. She's been here, waiting, for so long." The wind howled around them, the once peaceful graveyard now transformed into a place of haunting energy. The girl was still trembling, her small body visibly shaken, as if the fear she was feeling wasn't just from the moment. It was something much deeper, something ingrained in her soul. Without warning, a loud cracking sound erupted from the grave itself, the earth splitting open slightly, like the ground was being torn apart by an unseen force. Maria froze, her breath catching in her throat. She backed up instinctively, but the girl remained rooted to the spot, staring at the grave as if she had seen this all before. Maria's mind raced. Was this real? Was the earth really moving? Or was her mind playing tricks on her? But then, something even more disturbing happened. The grave began to glow, faint at first, but gradually growing stronger, as though something was rising from the depths of the earth. It wasn't the warm light of the setting sun, nor the glow of the moon. It was something unnatural, cold and dark, like the grave was calling out to something buried within it. The girl's voice, shaking with terror, broke the silence. "She's coming! It's too late!" Maria stepped back, her eyes wide with panic. The air around her seemed to thicken, and the sense of dread grew stronger. She could feel the coldness of the earth creeping into her very bones, chilling her from the inside out. And then from the darkness of the grave, a shadow began to form, a shadow that was both human and not. It was tall and formless, its outline distorted, as if the air itself couldn't contain its shape. The shadow seemed to stretch and shift, moving like liquid, pouring out of the grave and into the air around them. The girl backed away slowly, fear in her eyes. "It's her! She's free!" Maria could barely breathe as the figure in the grave seemed to solidify. It wasn't a human figure, not really. It was something more ancient, more primal, a presence so full of malice and grief that it made the air feel heavy, suffocating. The ground beneath their feet rumbled again, this time louder, as if the earth itself was protesting the figure's emergence. The figure slowly turned, and for the first time Maria could see something more, a pair of hollow, empty eyes staring directly at her, eyes that were filled with a sorrow and rage so deep that it threatened to swallow her whole. Maria gasped and took another step back, her feet stumbling in the uneven earth. "What? What is that?" The girl, still trembling, whispered. "It's the spirit, the one who's been waiting. She wants to be remembered." Before Maria could speak again, the figure moved, slowly, deliberately toward them. Its form flickered like a shadow in the wind, but its presence was undeniable. It was real, and it was here. Maria tried to take another step back, but the earth beneath her feet shifted once more. She felt the ground begin to give way, as though the grave itself was pulling at her, drawing her in. I I have to go," Maria whispered, panic rising in her throat. She turned to flee, but the girl stopped her with a soft, desperate cry. "You can't leave," the girl said, her voice breaking. "Not now. She won't let you." Maria's heart raced as the ground seemed to shift under her feet. She could feel the tremors growing stronger, the earth beneath her vibrating with an unnatural force. The air had grown thick with an ominous presence, as though the very atmosphere was alive, feeding off the fear that radiated from her. Her body screamed to flee, but the girl's words echoed in her mind. "You can't leave. She won't let you. She turned back toward the girl, whose face was twisted with terror. The once innocent child seemed almost possessed. Maria could feel the chill in the air, the creeping cold that threatened to consume her. She had to understand. Who was this spirit? What was it that kept it tethered to this grave? And why, of all things, was it drawing her in? The figure in the grave, now fully risen from the soil, seemed to flicker with a dark energy. Its form was still shifting, its shape barely human, as though it existed in a state between worlds. The hollow eyes locked onto Maria, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. There was nothing natural about this presence. Its energy was raw and malevolent, like a storm contained in a body that should not exist. Maria's breath hitched. She couldn't move. The figure began to take slow, deliberate steps toward her, its presence growing stronger with each passing second. It was as if it was feeding off her fear, growing more solid as she stood frozen before it. The girl, trembling uncontrollably, whispered, "She wants something from you." Maria shook her head, trying to break free from the paralysis that had gripped her. "What does she want from me? What is this?" The girl's voice faltered, filled with despair. "She was my mother, but she never—" The words caught in her throat. "She was angry when she died. She never wanted to leave. But I—" The girl cut herself off, her voice trembling with guilt. "I couldn't help her." Maria's mind was spinning. This girl was connected to the spirit. But how? Was she a victim, or was she somehow involved in this strange curse? Before she could ask anything more, the figure stopped. The air grew colder, the ground trembling as the presence loomed closer. Maria could feel the temperature drop so drastically that her breath was visible, the frost creeping across the edges of her vision. The figure's voice, a low, guttural whisper, filled the air. "I was not meant to leave," the figure rasped. "You cannot leave until I am at rest." The voice sent a chill down Maria's spine. The figure's eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to stare directly into her soul, as if it knew her deepest fears. Maria stumbled back, her pulse racing. "What do you want from me?" Maria's voice was shaky but determined. "I'm just a woman. I'm not here to take anything from you." The figure moved closer, its body flickering in and out of focus, as though it existed between the realms of the living and the dead. It didn't speak, but its energy grew stronger, pulling Maria toward the grave. She could feel an invisible force wrapping around her, tugging her body forward as if it was trying to drag her into the earth itself. "You cannot leave," the figure repeated, its voice like the crackling of dying embers. "Until I have been remembered. Until you understand my pain." Maria's eyes darted to the girl, but she couldn't see her face anymore. The girl had vanished into the shadows, leaving only her sobs behind. But Maria could still hear her voice, distant and faint, murmuring words she couldn't understand. The figure's presence was suffocating. It pressed in on her very thoughts, and she began to feel the weight of its centuries-old sorrow. There was something unfinished about it, something that had been left behind. The figure reached out with long, bony fingers, its touch cold enough to freeze her skin. Maria gasped, pulling away instinctively, but the invisible force held her in place. She could feel the darkness wrapping around her chest, crushing her lungs. "You were never meant to be forgotten," the figure whispered, "but you will remember me." In an instant, the ground trembled again, and Maria's body was yanked toward the grave. Her feet lifted off the ground as if she were weightless, and the world around her spun in a dizzying whirl of darkness. Her thoughts were scattered, her vision blurred, but she could still hear the figure's voice. "You are the last to remember, the last to see, and now you will join me." The graveyard was silent again, save for the sound of the wind howling through the trees. But Maria wasn't alone anymore. The air, once still, now seemed to pulse with an energy that sent chills through her. The figure was there, hovering in the shadows, and Maria realized too late that it wasn't done. It wasn't finished with her yet. Maria's heart thundered in her chest as the world around her grew colder, darker. The shadowy figure that stood before her seemed to distort, its shape flickering like a flame on the edge of extinction. its presence unsettlingly powerful. The force that held her body in place grew stronger, colder, like tendrils of ice wrapping around her legs, her arms, her chest. Her breathing became shallow as she tried to move, but the invisible grip kept her tethered to the spot. It was as though the earth itself was holding her there, unwilling to let her go. The weight of it pressed down on her, squeezing the air from her lungs. The shadow, now more solid than ever, stepped closer, its form taller and more distinct. "You cannot run from what is already written," the figure whispered in a voice that felt like it was scraping against her bones. "You are bound here, as I was bound. You will remember me." Maria could barely focus as the cold, dark energy swirled around her, threatening to swallow her whole. She struggled to take a breath, to think clearly, but the weight of the figure's presence was overwhelming. Her mind raced. "Remember." The words echoed through her thoughts, and she realized with a sickening lurch that the figure wasn't just seeking revenge, it was seeking recognition. It wanted to be acknowledged, its story to be told, its pain to be felt. The figure's head tilted slightly, its hollow eyes gleaming with a cold, empty sorrow. She could not rest because she was forgotten, it hissed, its voice now a hiss that reverberated through the graveyard, shaking the trees. "I was forgotten too, left to rot in silence, and now you will carry that memory with you. You will remember, and you will be part of it." Maria's pulse raced as she fought against the invisible force, the overwhelming sensation of dread beginning to fill her chest, her heart pounding against her ribs. She couldn't breathe. She could barely see through the swirling darkness around her. She tried to speak, to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The only sound was the growing wail of the figure, a sorrowful cry that shook the ground beneath him. "No, no, please," Maria whispered, her voice trembling, her body shaking with fear. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't let herself be pulled into whatever this was, but there was nothing she could do to stop it. The darkness was closing in, and she could feel herself slipping, slowly being consumed by it. The grave, the shadow, the earth, they all felt connected as though everything was part of the same ancient force that had been buried long ago. The cries of the forgotten, the souls trapped between worlds. Maria could almost hear them, feel them, clawing at her. The girl, the one who had been sitting by the grave, was now nowhere to be seen, but Maria could still feel her presence, lingering in the air. It was as if the girl had become part of the curse, part of the spirit's unfinished business. Maria closed her eyes, her mind spiraling into a panic as she felt her body being drawn closer to the grave, closer to the figure that was waiting for her. "This is it," she thought. "I'm going to be a part of this place, just like the others." But then, just as the figure reached out to claim her, a sudden flash of light erupted from the gravestone. It was bright and blinding, cutting through the thick shadows like a knife. Maria gasped, her body momentarily freed from the suffocating grip, and she stumbled backward, falling to her knees as the force around her seemed to weaken, just slightly. The figure recoiled, its form flickering, as though it had been hit by an unseen force. It let out a low, angry growl, but Maria couldn't take her eyes off the gravestone. The light continued to pulse from it, brighter now, and she saw something, a figure, faint at first, but slowly solidifying in the light. It was the girl, the figure of the girl who had been sitting by the grave, crying for her mother, now stood beside the gravestone. Her eyes, once filled with terror and sorrow, were now filled with a quiet determination. She stood tall, her hands raised toward the shadowy figure, the light from the grave shining around her like a shield. "No," the girl whispered, her voice stronger now, filled with purpose. "You will not claim her. You will not claim anyone again." The shadowy figure screamed, its form distorting violently, its hollow eyes flashing with fury. It reached out toward the girl, but she remained steadfast, her arms raised, the light around her intensifying. Maria watched in awe as the shadow seemed to shrink, its form flickering with each pulse of light from the grave. The figure's growls grew quieter, and the air around them began to change, shifting from suffocating darkness to a more familiar, peaceful calm. With one final, anguished cry, the figure of darkness dissolved into the air, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The graveyard was silent again, the oppressive energy lifting, leaving behind only the soft, fading glow from the gravestone. The girl slowly turned to Maria, her face now calm, no longer filled with fear or pain. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. "She can rest now, and so can I." The light from the grave began to fade, the graveyard returning to its quiet, peaceful state. The girl, now peaceful and free, slowly faded away into the evening air, leaving behind only the gravestone, still worn and weathered, but now silent. Maria stood in the graveyard, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on her. The darkness, the terror, it had all been so real, but now there was only peace, as if the very earth had exhaled, releasing a centuries-old burden. She took a deep breath, her heart still racing, but the fear was gone. The girl, the spirit, had been freed, and Maria had been part of that. She glanced at the grave one last time, now just a quiet stone, and turned to leave, knowing she would never forget this strange, dark encounter. Maria slowly walked away from the grave, her steps heavy, as though she were leaving behind a piece of herself. The air had cleared, the tension dissipating, but the memory of what had just transpired lingered. She could still feel the weight of the graveyard around her, as if the very earth had shifted with the darkness that had been released and then finally put to rest. Her thoughts raced as she walked, but in the pit of her stomach, there was a strange sense of peace. The girl, no longer lost, no longer trapped in her sorrow, had been freed, and Maria, for reasons she couldn't fully comprehend, had played a part in it. She reached the gates of the cemetery, and as she stepped outside, the weight of the world seemed to lift from her shoulders. The dark clouds that had once filled the sky had parted, and the last rays of the setting sun bathed the landscape in a soft golden light. For the first time in what felt like hours, she took a deep, steadying breath. But as she walked away, a thought lingered in the back of her mind. The girl had said something just before she disappeared. She can rest now. Maria knew that the girl had been more than just a spirit lost to time. She had been the key. But what had the girl meant when she said she could rest now? Was the spirit of her mother finally at peace? Or had there been something more? Something Maria hadn't fully understood. As she walked further from the cemetery, her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden feeling of something soft against her fingers. She looked down and, to her surprise, saw the teddy bear, the same light brown one the girl had left by her mother's grave, now resting in the palm of her hand. Maria stopped in her tracks. She hadn't noticed picking it up, but there it was, warm and oddly comforting in her grip. The bear seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, as if it carried a piece of the story with it, a piece of what had just occurred in the cemetery. She stood still, her heart racing once more, staring at the bear in her hand. It was as though it had followed her, as if the girl, whose spirit had found peace, had left it as a token, a final sign, a reminder of the journey she had taken, the bond between mother and daughter, and the price of disturbing the restless. Maria sighed deeply, her fingers tightening around the teddy bear. It was small, simple, but it was a part of something greater, something deeper. And now it was hers to keep, a reminder of what she had witnessed. She knew that she would never forget this experience, this strange, supernatural event that had left her questioning everything she had believed. She looked back one last time at the cemetery, now peaceful and quiet in the fading light of day. The grave was still there, just as it had always been, but there was no longer a sense of dread hanging over it. The ground had settled, the spirits had been put to rest. Maria took a deep breath and turned away, knowing that the story wasn't hers to tell, but it would live in her memory forever. She had been a part of something beyond understanding, something beyond explanation. But in the end, the darkness had been quelled, and the girl had found peace. And as she walked away from the graveyard, the world seemed a little quieter, a little lighter, as though the shadows that once lingered had finally been lifted. Maria smiled softly to herself, clutching the teddy bear close, knowing that whatever had transpired in that graveyard Whatever force had been awakened and then released had left an indelible mark on her soul. It was a story of loss, of redemption, of the balance between the living and the dead. And as the sun finally sank below the horizon, Maria felt the warmth of the day fading, but her heart was lighter.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.